Today we're talking about the successful conclusion to America's first opioid epidemic-based lawsuit. Now I'd give you the name of that lawsuit, but we're trying to keep this show under 30 minutes. So we'll just sum it up as Oklahoma versus pretty much the entire pharmaceutical industry. Wow, that's really a who's who of terrible companies. Now you're probably looking at the list and wondering, okay, why am I only hearing about Johnson & Johnson? Why isn't, say, Teva getting the same amount of attention? Well, that's what makes this case so important. Earlier this year, Oklahoma settled with OxyContin maker Purdue Pharma for $270 million and Teva Pharmaceuticals for $85 million, leaving Johnson & Johnson as the lone defendant. Furthermore, in settling out of court, Purdue and Teva did not admit any wrongdoing. It was at this point that Johnson & Johnson apparently said, "Hold my heroin. We're taking this one to the top." Turns out that's not a great idea, which is why no companies ever do that. Now because they fought this in court, well, it turns out there was wrongdoing in this case, leading to...
The lawsuit was seeking $17 billion in damages. The judge's ruling wasn't anywhere close to that. He awarded $572 million to the state, and he says based on the evidence that was presented to him over the 8-week trial that went on, that's what he's able to give to help what he said would abate the opioid problem, specifically in the state of Oklahoma.
Now it does seem as though Johnson & Johnson doesn't think they've dragged their brand's name through the dust quite enough just yet, so they're appealing the decision to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. Today though, I want to try to answer one very simple question. What, legally, did Johnson & Johnson do wrong? Now you're probably double checking the timestamp right now in this video because, wait, I'm pretty sure I got the gist of what they did wrong. How are we not halfway done with this episode yet? Well, the civil suit filed against them had huge implications for not just handling the opioid epidemic, but dealing with corporate actions that hurt all sorts of communities. Later in the episode, I even tie in the Deepwater Horizon disaster near the end. So buckle up, it's gonna be a wild ride. With that, let's crack open this case of Oklahoma versus just a whole bunch of bad companies. Now when you open this case, you immediately notice something very strange. The state's sole claim for relief against the defenders was for causing a public nuisance, and the state sought relief in the form of abatement of that nuisance. Guys, are we seriously calling the opioid epidemic a public nuisance? Yeah, you know that public nuisance that in Oklahoma alone killed 6,000 people, twice as many people as 9/11? Man, those pesky drug companies. Hey, whatever can get you to win the lawsuit though, I guess.
Now, the state had claimed that the company was a public nuisance.
So the job of the state attorney general at this point was to say that this whole opioid crisis was a public nuisance caused by Johnson & Johnson. And much like the kid who spray painted over the city's downtown statue, well, they're gonna have to pay to fix it. Legally, the trial centered on the state's perhaps unprecedented attempt to claim that the drug company created a public nuisance in the state of Oklahoma. Historically, that law is being used against loud neighbors, brothels, and polluters who use their properties in ways that harmed others. Now, the key word in that article was the word unprecedented. Because if you could create legal precedent of using public nuisance laws to prosecute those Dennis the Menace style big pharma companies, well then a lot more states would have a leg to stand on regarding their own opioid accountability. You see, back in May we saw a very similar lawsuit in South Dakota get dismissed because, and I'll quote the judge, the state does not have a cause of action for the nuisance against Purdue, since its nuisance claim arises from the overprescribing and sale of opioids manufactured by Purdue. So it's at this point that you're probably wondering, what's all this public nuisance talk about anyways? I mean, surely we've created a law that says you can't, well, what specifically did they do?
They sued Johnson & Johnson, Purdue Pharma, and Teva Pharmaceuticals for aggressively marketing opioids to doctors while significantly downplaying the addiction risks.
Now don't get me wrong, I hate ads as much as the next guy, but that marketing campaign sounds like a lot more than a nuisance. They had all the evidence of false advertising they needed, so why are we talking about nuisances at all? Now, this search for truth plunged me down quite a deep rabbit hole. According to the Columbia Journal of Law and Social Problems, the goal is to assert that without manufacturers' actions, opioid use would not have become so widespread, and the enormous public health hazard of opioid overuse, abuse, and addiction that now exists would have been averted. This means that, despite the fact that the public nuisance sounds very minor, it's actually all-encompassing. Now sure, we could go after you for mass production, alleged misrepresentations, and other actions, but I want more justice then.
The Dannon Company has agreed to a huge settlement over charges it made improper health claims for its yogurt and dairy drinks.
Because your misleading campaign killed thousands of people, while Activia just left a few people with slightly more intense than expected poop sessions, how am I gonna get the damages from those acts tied in with the acts themselves? Well, I'm going to say that the opioid epidemic was a public nuisance that your corporate actions created, and therefore you have to pay to clean it up. Now precedent here is a little hard to find because most companies settle out of court or their cases get dismissed. The biggest potential obstacle here is that generally the public nuisance angle has only been successful when applied to property damage, and it's a little harder to pay for societal damage caused by corporate actions. Don't worry though, people have been trying to shove the square peg of societal justice into this hole for decades now. For example, environmentalists tried to retool nuisance law as a weapon against pollution and other social problems in the early 1970s, but that failed. The most recent are tobacco lawsuits in the 1990s that claim that the marketing of cigarettes was a public nuisance, although the only court to decide the matter rejected the theory in 1997. And the other challenges were all settled out of court, although one of the most famous out-of-court settlements was for $6 billion.
The tobacco industry has surrendered, and they have surrendered on our terms.
Those terms continue to deliver today. The $6 billion settlement brings tens of millions of dollars into Minnesota for anti-smoking and public health programs.
Now this case is so significant because there was no settlement and it hasn't gotten thrown out. If it continues, people are saying, what other manufacturers can we sue? Unfortunately for gun control advocates, gun lawsuits may have been headed the same way, until Congress passed a statute eliminating most liability for gun manufacturers over crime committed with their products. Of course, that's the industry we'd all protect. Now I started getting curious about other times companies messed up. And yep, Deepwater Horizon settlement. That was another big public nuisance. Exxon Valdez, a failed public nuisance trial followed by a settlement. You can trace pretty much every massive corporate whoopsie-daisy with a public nuisance lawsuit or settlement. Because of this, this case is unsettled and actually winning, so this might not be great for corporate America. In fact, I'm surprised every major energy company in this country isn't funding Johnson & Johnson's defense on this one. This success would give states' attorneys general a lot more discretion in what problems they can charge companies to fix. So what's different about this case? Well, to explain that, we need to go back to the case brief. The main reason is that, unlike most states' nuisance laws, in Oklahoma the plain text of the statute did not limit public nuisances to those that affect property. Now, this might seem weird, but the distinction here comes from the Oklahoma legislature giving their attorney general a lot more leeway and power than most states. Now that all sounds like a bit of a legally questionable interpretation of the data. But let's check in with Oklahoma's Supreme Court, the highest court of the land. Luckily, we have a precedent-setting case from 1916. Now to put that time period into context, that's about 10 years after the other debate Oklahoma is famous for. don't worry, the farmer and the cowman were able to settle their differences out of court. The conflict in this case was that old man C.C. Epps' company up the road put in a large polluting cotton gin in his yard. It was making the air unbreathable and driving down property values. The Oklahoma Supreme Court looked at the case and ordered the company to pay damages, which led to today's Attorney General arguing, Supreme Court precedent also supports the conclusion that Oklahoma's nuisance law extends beyond the regulation of real property and encompasses the corporate activity complained of here. Now this confused me quite a bit, because wait, isn't that polluting cotton gin property? The important part to this case was that it wasn't the fact that the gin was there that was the problem. It was actually twofold. First, I'm no gin expert, but according to the case, there are legal ways to operate a cotton gin without making a ton of noise and flinging stuff everywhere. And this guy was not following those rules. The property wasn't the problem here, as despite the fact that it was the early 19th century, and I think we were giving kids raw mercury as toys, we had a general idea that this stuff was bad and damaging, so the activities going on at this mill were illegal. Second, if they believe from the evidence that the plaintiff was damaged as alleged in the petition, but that said damage was contributed to on account of operations of other gins or mills in the vicinity, they would have to find for the defendant, who was the guy being sued. Yeah, it was the wild, wild Midwest, and all the gins were flouting the law. How could you make sure that this gin was the one doing all the polluting, when the one down the street was pumping out all the same junk? This same question loomed over today's trial, as Johnson & Johnson reportedly claimed that beyond its poppy business, Johnson & Johnson's drugs accounted for less than 1% of the opioids prescribed in Oklahoma and the United States. So why are you forcing them to pay for all the stuff that blew over from other companies that you settled with? Yeah, Johnson & Johnson were really throwing Purdue and Teva under the bus in this one. The court's resolution to both of these dilemmas were very similar though. With regard to the illegal gins, it said that there was no substantial evidence in the record that showed that the damage was contributed to in any material respect by other gins located in the community, and therefore it was the illegal actions of this one gin that was causing all the damage. In today's case, there was a long list of evidence describing Johnson & Johnson's wrongdoings, each word making me angrier than the last. This led the judge to write, there are no intervening causes that supervened or superseded defendants' actions and omissions as a direct cause of the state's injuries, or otherwise defeating a finding of direct and proximate cause. Have fun saying that 3 times fast. To translate that from legal to Americans, basically, nah, it was definitely you. Because of this, Johnson & Johnson has had to pay over $500 million to repair the public nuisances of an opioid epidemic that they caused in Oklahoma. Go cry over that loss in your shower. Oh wait, never mind. Thank you, and that's all I have to say about that. Hello YouTube! If you want to support independent, nonpartisan news, remember to subscribe by clicking on this floating logo to the right of my head. Ring that bell so that freedom will continue to ring, and give me a thumbs up if you like what you saw. Lastly, as always, thank you for watching.